He didn't fall. He just froze, in the middle of the liturgy, with his hand raised as if in blessing, and suddenly began to lose his shape, first from his nose, then from his ears. Pus mixed with streaks of gray mucus began to flow. When he turned away from the altar, one of the deacons screamed. The bishop's brain began to ooze down his face like vomit, breaking through the skull bones. This happened in St. Mauritius Cathedral on Christmas Day, in front of a full choir and dozens of witnesses. Bishop Dietrich of Merseburg, who had lived on the brink of damnation and worship, did not die immediately. He stood there and continued to drip, slowly and horribly, like a candle made of dead flesh. In a report by the monk Ebo, later banned from correspondence, it is said, "He spoke, but there were no words. Steam came out of his mouth like from a cauldron. His eyes floated like a boiled egg." No one approached him. The service was interrupted, and the body was left untouched. Only 2 days later did the monks dare to wrap the remains in cloth and carry them out of the temple, which was permeated with a stench that neither honey nor incense could dispel. But that was only the beginning. The first signs of his decay began to appear in the fall. At that time, the bishop's office only noted his fatigue, inconsistency in his decisions, complaints of heaviness in his head, and a cloudy gaze. He increasingly refused food, asked for water with vinegar, and ordered the windows to be kept open despite the cold. His servants whispered that at night he moaned as if someone were gnawing at him from the inside. He often rubbed his temples, leaving abrasions and bloodstains on his skin. Dr. Theodore of Quedlinburg, who was called in to examine him, wrote in his report, "The body temperature is normal, but the skin on the skull is softer than it should be. When pressed, there is a feeling of mobility under the skin, like rot under the bark of a tree." The bishop was treated according to custom: bloodletting through a vein in the neck, burning of bad juices with a red-hot iron in the hypochondrium, rubbing with a mixture of nutmeg, bull fat, and ashes infused with wine. He did not resist. He was silent. Only once, as recorded in the doctor's diary, did he whisper, "I can see them digging." No one understood who he meant. His chambers were closed. Only 3 trusted men were allowed to approach him: Chancellor Martin, the herbalist monk Hildebrand, and his personal cook. The latter soon fled, according to the guards, in hysterics, with his fingernails bitten down to the quick. He was later found in the river, his tongue missing. The archdeacon's report contained a note. The bishop complained that his food was moving in his mouth. "We gave it to the dogs. They didn't touch it." Dietrich's paranoia intensified. He ordered the walls of his bedroom to be covered with cloth, the names of everyone who entered and left to be written down, and a bowl of salt to be brought to his chambers every 2 hours, so that the smell would not forget where it came from. There were whispers in the church that the bishop was cursed. His flock avoided even talking about him. The guards at the cathedral gates were changed daily. Many complained of ringing in their ears and weakness. One suffered seizures after night watch. Another died while trying to remove his helmet. Letters supposedly written on behalf of the bishop became strange, brief, incoherent, with repeated words. In one of them, addressed to the chapter, the word "seal" was written 10 times. The handwriting was sharp and uneven, unlike his previous style. Chancellor Martin claimed that the bishop had written it himself. However, one of the scribes made a note in his diary. He holds the pen with his knuckles. It's as if his fingers don't feel the paper. He no longer spoke at audiences. He only pointed, nodded, and sometimes smiled inappropriately. His hair was thinning, and the skin on his head began to peel. The monks suspected illness. The doctor diagnosed bone decay. But an autopsy performed secretly after his death, as indicated in the unofficial version of the medical treatise on the destruction of the flesh through the mind, showed that instead of solid tissue, the skull contained a soft mass that emitted the smell of rotten fish. Before Christmas, 9 days before his death, He stopped recognizing his closest relatives. He sat in a chair all day, not answering, but sometimes he began to whisper something. A clerk, who accidentally overheard his words, wrote down, "They are drilling. They want to get out." Who they were was not specified. On the fourth night, the guards saw him standing at the window, naked, shaking, whispering prayers that no one knew. The servants began to fall ill. 3 of them developed a fever accompanied by hallucinations. One of the senior monks claimed that at night he saw a black bird flying in circles above the bishop's palace and crying out in a human voice. He disappeared 2 days later. He was never found. In his last conscious act, Dietrich ordered the icon brought from Wales to be burned. It stood at the head of his bed. "It is laughing," he said, "and showing me what will happen." The icon was not burned. It was hidden in the basement. Later, when they tried to retrieve it, the wood was stained with black mold. When Christmas morning came, the bishop himself asked to be carried to the altar. 4 men carried him, and 2 carried black bowls of aromatic resin to mask the smell. The church was silent. He uttered his first words in several days. "He is already here." And in an instant, his skull began to deform. His skin became covered with blisters, and a thick liquid flowed from his nose, eyes, and ears. There was no scream, only a sob. One. After what happened, the cathedral was closed for 3 days. No one touched the altar. They said that dark marks remained on the stones, which could not be removed with water or ashes. The monks were silent, and the servants avoided walking through the corridors leading to the bishop's chambers. Fear paralyzed everything. A commissioner of the chapter arrived from Regensburg to investigate the unusual manifestation of bodily decomposition during life. His name did not appear in the chronicles, but in the chronology attributed to the monk Florian, it is mentioned. He entered the bishop's chambers at the 7th hour and left at the 8th, white as chalk, silently, without saying goodbye, and left the next morning. The bishop's body was not buried. It was kept in a crypt under the cathedral, wrapped in woolen cloths, poured over with oil and herbal tinctures. However, the smell did not diminish. On the contrary, it became thick, cloying, penetrating even the stone walls. Those who served in the crypt began to lose consciousness. 3 died within a week. One of them was an apprentice pharmacist, and he left a note in his notebook. His eyes remained open, and I swear, his pupils were down, as if he were looking into his own belly. While the body was rotting, the office was decapitated. The archdeacon, acting as temporary head, sent letters to Mainz asking for a new head to be sent, but there was no reply. The war between the princes of Swabia and Thuringia reached its climax. The roads became dangerous, and messengers disappeared. Against the backdrop of lawlessness in Merseburg, rumors began to surface about the bishop's old sins, about secret executions carried out on his personal orders, about girls who disappeared from the orphanage. The basement where the records were kept burned down. No one admitted to arson. One of the chapter's reports, dated 9 days after his death, states, "Some nuns from the convent of St. Irmenberga saw in a vision worms crawling out of the bishop's skull, and they had the faces of babies. The eldest of the sisters lost her speech." This document was later confiscated, but a copy was preserved in the Brunswick Library. Strange things were happening in the bishop's chambers on the upper floor of the cathedral. Mirrors that had previously hung on the walls cracked. The water in the washing bowls turned sour overnight. A rustling sound could be heard from behind the closed windows. Hildebrand, a monk and herbalist, brought a bunch of garlic and holy salt into the room, but was found dead with bloody fingernails, in a position as if he had been trying to scratch something out of his own chest. A note was clutched in his hand. He has not left. The bishop, as it turned out, had left no will. This gave rise to a wave of speculation. Chancellor Martin was found with his throat cut on the 4th day after the second autopsy. Presumably, he was trying to hide some paper found in a hiding place behind the coffin. There was a medallion engraved with a crucifix, in which the Savior was replaced by a woman with a swollen belly. The origin of the artifact is unclear. It was burned without ceremony. One of the few surviving guards who served at the dying man's bedside gave an oral testimony recorded by the monk Hugo of Halberstadt. "Twice, I saw something crawling on the floor in his chambers. It was not a human being. It was not an animal. It left a slimy trail," the bishop whispered to it, not with words, but with a guttural wet sound like boiling broth. I heard only one name, Atto. At the same time, a plague broke out in the city. It was strange, unlike any before. The sick had no carbuncles or ulcers, only headaches, lethargy, and loss of mind. The townspeople began to speak in strange voices, answering questions before they were asked, wandering the streets, not knowing their own names. More than 30 people were locked up in the monastery of St. Sebald. 3 of them shouted in anger, "He wants to come out," before burning themselves to death. At the insistence of the chapter, it was decided to reopen the bishop's body. 2 doctors from Prague, who arrived secretly, were entrusted with the autopsy. Their report, known as the Tractatus de Putredo Sacerdotes, loosely translated read, "The skull is almost completely hollow. Inside is a lump of gray-green mucus. The back of the skull appears to have melted. From the head to the chest is a trail of thick, sticky substance that smells like rotten tissue. The rib cage is intact, but the liver has been softened to a pulp. The heart is missing. In its place is a crumpled knot of blood vessels, wrapped in parchment tape." The tape, as indicated in the note, bore the words, "The flesh is wine, the brain is a lock, the spirit is a guest." What this meant is not explained. The funeral was postponed. No monk agreed to accompany the body. No bell ringer dared to ring the bell. Only 22 days later were his remains carried out at night, without ceremony, without a procession, accompanied by silent novices. Their faces were hidden. A report from the court chaplain states, "When the coffin lid was closed, it began to shake. No one returned for it. The coffin was buried in the ground at the edge of the monastery garden without a plaque. In the morning, a white mushroom, as thick as a hand, sprouted over the grave. It was picked, but a new one grew the next day. The winter in Merseburg was harsh. The snow did not melt even at the altars. The temperature in the crypt dropped so low that the candles cracked when lit. However, the bishop's body did not freeze. According to the abbot, moisture emanated from him like hot bread, only with the smell of rot. Those who approached felt slightly dizzy and began to tremble involuntarily. More than a month had passed since Christmas when the first signs of secondary tissue decomposition appeared. Too late, even by the standards of medicine at the time. Black spots appeared on his stomach, and in the previously empty skull cavity, a clot of yellow substance resembling cottage cheese was found. Father Friedrich, a surgeon from Merseburg, noted that this happens when the body is cursed or was the carrier of a disease of the soul. No one disputed this diagnosis. At a council of archdeacons convened in February, it was decided to finally commit the remains to the earth and concrete over the crypt. However, before this, they insisted on performing an exorcism, even though the practice had long been banned in the empire. 2 men arrived, one old, with half his face paralyzed, the other young, but blind. Neither gave their names. They had been brought from a monastery, standing on a marsh. It was said that they had previously served at a church where a baby without eyes had once been found in the altar. The ceremony took place at midnight, in the presence of 6 witnesses. They all took an oath of silence, but years later, Monk Rupert wrote in his diary, "When the reading began, the body rose, not much, but it lifted off the stone, and then the coffin burst open, as if it had been squeezed from the inside, we felt the air inside the cathedral become salty. In the same diary, he writes that one of the exorcists died that same night, and the other's tongue turned black and fell off a day later. The body was buried. The place where it was laid was sprinkled with salt and covered with lime. They covered it with earth, placed 3 stones on top, but did not put a slab over it. This was the order of the archdeacon. A week later, a new decree arrived from Mainz: appoint a temporary administrator and seize all records related to the bishop's death. In particular, the report, Tractatus de Putredo Sacerdotes. The archdeacon obeyed, but copied the treatise by hand. This copy later ended up in the library of the monastery of St. Lutgardis. It was kept there until 1584, when it was confiscated by the Inquisition commissioner. In the spring, 3 children disappeared from the city. One of them, the baker's son, was found dead in the basement of the cathedral. He was lying on the site of the old bishop's throne, his eyes closed and his mouth sewn shut. Next to him lay a tile with the inscription, Pata qui non dormiat. The inscription was in Church Slavonic, but no one knew who had written it. Against a backdrop of fear and emptiness, the authorities began to crumble. Local judges did not convene. Ambassadors from Bamberg did not arrive for Easter Mass. Merchants gave the city a wide berth. Archdeacon Thomas, who was still acting as head of the church, began sending letters to Prague, Vienna, and even Rome, begging for a representative to be sent. To no avail. People began to leave the city. Shops, warehouses, and mills were deserted. By spring, a third of the houses stood without windows. Hungry dogs appeared on the streets. They howled at night and rummaged through the ashes. At that time, people began to talk about a guest who whispers in the dark. At first, it was only children, then adults. One woman, the widow of a clerk, burned down her house, claiming that there was a man with a bandaged head sitting in the cellar. Repeating her name, but without a mouth, the archdeacon ordered the body to be dug up. This happened in May. 4 men were gathered, 2 gravediggers, a chaplain, and a young pharmacist. Everyone was silent. Removing the top layer of earth, they found that the lime had turned black, and in the center, where the coffin had been, there was nothing but emptiness. It was not an empty coffin, but an empty space, as if the earth had rejected the body. They climbed down into the pit, but found nothing. No wood, no cloth, only wet, loose soil. One of the gravediggers disappeared that same night. The second was found hanged in the bell tower. The apothecary fled, and the chaplain lost his speech. When this became known in Mainz, a new decree was issued to close the cathedral for an indefinite period, cancel services, and suspend all mention of the deceased. The bishop's name was struck from the lists. A clay cross was placed on the wall in his chambers, without icons or inscriptions. At the end of summer, a procession from Swabia arrived at the monastery of St. Ermenberg. They asked for shelter for the night. The nuns did not let them in. There were too many who came and did not leave. Then they went to the cathedral. They were never seen again. When the emperor's ambassador arrived in Merseburg in early September, the city resembled an empty vessel. The stone houses stood with boarded-up windows, and the smell of smoke and dampness hung in the air. There were no children, no merchants, no guards on the streets, only the wind blowing rubbish across the broken slabs, and the hunched figures of monks silently crossing the square in the evenings, carrying candles to the boarded-up cathedral. The ambassador, a pragmatic man from Passau, refused to enter the former bishop's residence. He settled in an abandoned house on the outskirts and kept watch through messengers and bribed servants. In a report to the imperial chancellor, dated September 25th, he wrote, "The situation is worse than expected. There are rumors of a vow of silence, of tongues being cut out, of children who are no longer being buried. The clergy are depressed and paralyzed with fear. The administration has disappeared. Archdeacon Thomas has not left his cell since June. In October, despite the concrete, the bishop's tomb began to sink. The ground around it cracked, and the crypt smelled of rotten eggs. One of the monks complained of knocking under the floor, but his words were not documented. He soon disappeared. The abbot tried to arrange for the removal of the remains, but twice in a row the coffin was not found. In both cases, only slime and charred pieces of fabric were found under the lime. Closer to Christmas, new priests arrived at the monastery. They were brought not by letter, but by fear, from Leipzig, Halle, Magdeburg. They were mostly young, determined to seal the evil. On the 40th day before Christmas, they organized a ceremony of great purification. They celebrated Mass, poured oil and incense into the tomb, and read 21 psalms. On the night after the ceremony, a fire broke out. The fire broke out simultaneously in 3 places: the library, the refectory, and the sacristy. The firefighters did not arrive. They were already gone. The monks tried to extinguish the flames themselves, but to no avail. The archives were burned, including a copy of the Tractatus de Putredos Sacerdotes, Rupert's diary, and the archdeacon's letters. When the charred floors collapsed in the morning, the bodies of 3 people were found. All had their skulls cracked open. Their brains were missing. Archdeacon Thomas died 2 days later. According to a witness, he mumbled incoherently, tried to burn his hands, and spat blood. After his death, his body was not buried. It was taken to the forest and left under a fir tree. This was the decision of the monks. They believed that this would save the remnants of the community. On Christmas Day, 3 drunken soldiers from a detachment that had accidentally spent the night by the city wall broke into the cathedral. They were found the next day. One of them had no eyes, the second had no tongue, the third had his skull cut open, but his brain was nearby, neatly laid out on the floor, as if someone had shaken it out like porridge from a bag, according to a clerk from Ingolstadt, who arrived later to inspect the scene. This event was the last straw. The Mainz Cathedral Council decided to disband the community, close the monastery, and prohibit anyone from living within a 7-mile radius. The place was declared deserted. The map of the region was redrawn. The name Merseburg was removed from the census records. The remaining nuns were sent to various shelters. One of them, Sister Gertrude, later wrote, "We left, but we could still hear footsteps and breathing in our ears. We knew it wasn't over yet." That's how the official story ended. However, in 1608, during another conflict for the throne in Saxony, 4 bodies were found in the vicinity of the former Merseburg. All of them were missing their skulls. Each had a clay cross placed on it. The bodies lay where the bishop's throne had once stood. A plaque was found nearby: "I am not forgotten." In response, the rulers again ordered everything to be destroyed. The remains of the buildings were dismantled. The stones were buried. The river that flowed nearby was diverted. The field where the cathedral had stood was sown with wheat. But after a year, nothing grew there. The earth was covered with a black crust, and even the birds would not land there. Centuries later, the story returned to folk legends. The bishop came to be known as "he whose brain did not rest." He was mentioned in old prayers as a symbol of the sins of pride and unbelief. Pilgrims who happened to pass by the abandoned road said they heard breathing under their feet, especially in December. And on Christmas Eve, according to legend, steam rises from the ground, not from the cold, but because he is trying to speak again. Historians who later studied the surviving letters agreed that what happened in Merseburg was not the result of a disease, but of mass religious hysteria, exacerbated by fear, isolation, and harsh winters. However, some records, including excerpts from servants' testimonies, continue to raise questions. For example, the report of the pharmacist Bernhard, who survived the events and wandered around monasteries afterwards, states, "What flowed out of the bishop's head was not just brain matter. It moved I saw it pulsating, and I heard it breathing. Since then, no one has returned to Merseburg.